it feels very much like the music only exists as a backdrop to the action, which I think is great because the emotion has to be the center of the story, especially in a show like this, and it does a great job with it. Hey, welcome back to Off Book. In each episode this season, we'll be taking a look at a different musical and breaking down the music and story of the show to try to understand what made it so popular. This week's show is 36 Questions. What makes this show different than the rest of the ones we've covered on the show is that this is a podcast musical, which basically just means that you're listening to the cast album, but then the actors keep talking after the songs on top of some great sound design. It has 3 acts and was released back in 2017, starring Jonathan Groff and Jesse Shelton. It was also recently announced that Netflix was in talks to adapt it into a feature film, and I'm so excited. It's not nearly as popular as I feel like it deserves to be, so go listen to that after you finish this. But despite that, it's one of very few and one of the best, in my opinion, podcast musicals to really ever exist. I think it does a great job of delivering on every single component of a Broadway musical, despite not having a crucial piece of the traditional format. So how does a show so new manage to revolutionize the medium it is in? Let's take a look. The story of 36 Questions is interesting because, in essence, this guy named Jace meets this girl named Natalie. They start dating and eventually get married, and then Jace finds out that Natalie was lying about who she was. Her actual name was Judith Ford, and Natalie was a fake persona the whole time. And so they break up, and he leaves, and then she comes to his house with a list of 36 questions that scientists have determined will help people that are meeting each other fall in love. The study actually exists. There is a list of 36 questions. I don't know how accurate the show is to the actual questions, but it is based on something real. Something else of note is that, much like the last 5 years, 36 Questions only has 2 characters, Jace and Judith/Natalie, and there aren't a ton of shows that only have 2 characters. The last 5 years is really the one that gets brought up pretty much every single time because there aren't that many to go off of. But I think it's so genius that they wrote the show like this, because you really can't do a big show-stopping number if you don't have any visuals. This is an audio-only format, so knowing that it has to be a little bit of a smaller story and deciding that the best thing to do is just to lean into that is really smart, because it allows you to capitalize on the fact that you can get really close to these characters because you're right there with them. You're not a million feet behind the stage sitting in the 5th row of the second balcony. They're in your ears. They're right there, and you can get the full story wherever you are. It's something about podcasts in general is that it's very personal because it can kind of follow you wherever you go. To go see a musical, you have to go to the theater. To go see a movie, you have to be in front of a TV. But a podcast, you often don't listen to, in groups. There aren't a ton of group podcast listening sessions. So, to listen to a podcast, you're often by yourself. And the podcast is right in your ears. So, there's something that's very personal about the format. And I think that the writers of this musical knew that and wanted to capitalize on it, knowing that they couldn't do a full 80-person company correctly, knowing that there was kind of an inherent closeness between the podcast and the podcast listener, and knowing that if they write to those strengths, they can create something that seems to fit very well, because it was written specifically for that format. I'm very interested to see how the Netflix movie will pull this off, because the musical is so tailored to the podcast format. I think it can work. I think that the story can work in a visual medium, but I think that what's amazing is it's written for the podcast form. It wasn't a story that was written for a Broadway musical and they couldn't get funding, so let's make it a podcast. Or at least if it was, I don't know the history of the idea. Even if it was, they put a lot of work into making sure that they then tailored it to the format. I mentioned the sound design, which adds a lot to the story because you don't get the visuals. So you have a story that works for the medium, but you also need something to kind of supplement that, because just some people singing and talking isn't enough, because that's just a glorified cast album. So by adding that sound design, it really makes you feel like you're right there, because you can hear the whole environment. You can hear the footsteps, you can hear the rain, you can hear the cell phone ringing, you can hear everything that's so important to the story. So you feel like you're right there. And it feels almost like it's just a Broadway musical but without the visuals. But it's a show that's written so that it doesn't need them. It's a show that's written so that it all makes sense the way that it is presented to you. And I think that that's hard to do when there are so many givens when you're writing a musical. There's the opening number, there's the act 1 finale, there's the act 2 opener that's not that important, so that way the audience has time to come back from the bathroom. There's the 11 o'clock number and the finale, and this show doesn't really have any of those, which is a bold move, but it's one that I really appreciate, because they know what they have to do to get it to work in the podcast form, and they're doing that. The performances are so incredible. Jonathan Groff and Jesse Shelton both are really good in their roles. It's clear they put a lot of work into this. It's clear that they have really great chemistry together, and they bring a lot of humanity and depth to these characters, which is very impressive considering that you only have their voice. There aren't a ton of formats where it's a narrative story and you only have the character's voice to bring you through that journey. It's hard coming from someone who's recording a podcast right now, the one you're listening to, this one. It's hard to continue to make sure that you sound expressive in your voice, because there isn't another way for the audience to tell that you're being expressive. You don't get any sort of facial movements, you don't get any sort of body language, it's just your voice. So you have to make sure that you're being expressive with your voice, so that way it doesn't sound boring, because you don't have anything else to rely on. And I think that adding that narrative to it, where it's not just being expressive and interesting to listen to, it's also being emotional, and trying to convey these very precise, very subtle and nuanced performances that seem very realistic, but also very complex and layered in a way that you often don't find just in real life. This isn't something you'd find in your day-to-day life. This is a very heightened state of reality, and the fact that these writers were able to write something that just through the dialogue can sound so heartfelt and so passionate and so captivating, and that the actors could then take that and make it sound so perfect and so complete with just their voices, and can get all of these emotions and can really bring you to tears just with the way that they can manipulate their voice. It's really good, and the singing is great, and the sound design is really good. I think that sound design isn't something you get a ton in musicals. I think that there should be more sound design in musicals. I think it's really cool. Coming from a film background, I love sound design. And the sound effects in this show aren't the best, but they're pretty good. And I think they get their point across. And I think that that's something that's so great about this show, is that it knew what it needed to be, and it went and did that. The writing is tailored to the medium. The performances are amazing. The sound design works great. The 3-act structure is very weird, but it actually really works. I was very confused when I first heard the musical, because I ended Act 2 and went,
"This is the end? This doesn't sound right."
And then I realized,
oh no, there's an entire hour and a half left of the show because there's a third act.
It's roughly 3 hours. The acts aren't all the same length, but it's weird to have a 3-act structure. But they knew that the story that they were telling had a 3-act structure, and so they put it in a 3-act structure, and it works so well. You know, Act 1 is kind of them meeting and getting the ball rolling, getting this relationship, or kind of lack thereof, rehabilitated. Act 2 is kind of the fall apart they have, and then Act 3 is the resolution, where everything starts to kind of fall back into place, so that way when you reach the ending, I don't want to spoil it, but when you reach the ending, it all feels very coherent. And there are nice breaks. So if you're only going to listen to an act, it's not going to be fully fulfilling, because you're only listening to a third of a story, but it is kind of its own complete arc. You get the sense that we've been on a journey, just like a 2-act structure would do, but this does it 3 times, and it did it 3 times because it knew there were 3 parts of a story, and so to try to turn that into a 2-act structure just doesn't make a bunch of sense, and they knew that. And I think that it just goes to show how much work was put into making sure that this musical did exactly what it needed to. It's very well done. Have I mentioned that I like this show? I feel like I should probably say it again. I like this show. It's not something you find very often, and there aren't a ton of references to go off of in terms of how do you make a podcast musical? How much sound design do you put? What does the music sound like? There's not a ton of precedence for how that works. but the writers did such a good job figuring out what they wanted and doing it. I think that the story feels very organic. That's something that I find a lot of stories struggle with, is making sure that the plot points seem like they're happening and then the characters are reacting, and sometimes characters cause things to happen, but not always, and nothing can happen just because the plot needs it to. There needs to be a good reason. It needs to make sense. Even if we don't know the reason, it needs to feel like there was one. And that often doesn't happen, but I think that this show does a great job of making sure it all feels organic, that the characters are making choices, and sometimes those choices influence other choices, and sometimes there are things out of their control. But when there are things that happen out of their control, it feels like it happened and then they reacted, not that it happened because they needed to react. Sure, everything makes sense and everything works together, and the characters respond, and it does often become an integral part of the plot, but it feels like this could have happened at any other time. Not that it needed to happen right now because the plot said so. The scenes all work very well together, and you get the sense that if this thing interrupted the scene didn't happen, the scene could have continued, and the story would have gone 18 different directions depending on, the forces outside of their control had been changed. And I think that that's the mark of a truly good story, is that you get the sense that this is bigger than just the plot points, that these are characters living their lives, and that if any one choice had been changed, these characters would have lived just as realistic a life, and just as interesting a life. It's just not the version of events that happened, but that it could have happened, and it would have been interesting to watch. Today's episode is sponsored by 63 Inquiries. Not based on 36 questions. 63 Inquiries is a reverse podcast musical, which basically just means that it's a staged musical, but it's silent. So instead of having audio but not visuals, you have visuals but no audio. It has incredible harmonies that you can't hear, very poetic and inspirational lyrics that you can't hear, and witty and comedic dialogue that you still can't hear. So, yeah, no, I think it's going to take Broadway by storm. It's the next Hamilton. It'll do for staged musicals what 36 Questions did for podcast musicals. It's so incredibly moving. I hope it's really just life-changing. I hope. Basically, I just hope that it's good. I really hope that it's good. It might be. Anyway, music. The music of the show is interesting because, unlike a lot of Broadway musicals, this doesn't have the standard instrumentation of a pit orchestra, because it isn't a pit orchestra. The majority of this show is scored with just a piano and a guitar and some percussion. There are some other instruments. There are some trumpets, there are some synthesizers, there are some bass guitars, but they come in very sporadically. Most of the show feels a lot like a demo album. It feels like a workshop. And I'm not entirely sure how I feel about that. I definitely think the music sounds cool. I don't know if it would benefit from more instruments or not. I don't think it would, at least not in this format. It might work for the Netflix movie to add more instrumentation to kind of fill out the orchestra because it has the visuals in the movie format. But I think the way that it is right now with just the audio, with such a small story, I think that the fact that it's scored with only the piano and the guitar and the percussion really, for most of the show, does a lot to help the show, because it feels just like the story feels. It doesn't sound needlessly big, it doesn't sound showy, it just sounds like this is music. And it sounds very emotional, I think there's something about just a 3-instrument band or something like that that feels very raw and emotional, and I think when you write it correctly, as they have in this show, it manages to create this tone that feels like a great backdrop for the stuff that's happening, because it lets you into their heart. You can see what they're feeling, you can hear rather what they're feeling, what they're thinking. But also I think the use of that instrumentation lets you into what they're feeling, because it evokes a similar feeling in you to what they're feeling. And so by making you feel sad when they're sad, and joyful when they're joyful, and ecstatic when they're ecstatic, and also telling you how they feel and why they feel that way, and the kind of the subtleties of that feeling, it really makes you feel like you're right there with them, because you can feel a similar feeling, and you know why they're feeling that, which almost makes it feel like you're feeling that for the same reason, even though in reality you're not. This musical does a great job in giving both characters of this show their fair share of solo numbers, but also the group numbers. And the lyrics are very plain, but in the best way possible. There isn't a ton of wordplay in the show, except for there's one song in the end of Act 3 called Attachment.
Dear Judith, I owe you some answers. 16 to be exact.
But in addition to being very catchy, there's wordplay because he's writing an email to Judith, and he's including some of his answers to the 36 questions as an attachment. But also, attachment as in, you feel attached to somebody else. You have that attachment to Judith in this case. And so there's some of that throughout the show, but there isn't a bunch. There isn't a ton of internal rhyming or weird Sondheim-esque 12/8 bars, as far as I can tell at least. It sounds very simple, but again, just like with the instrumentation, it works, especially in this medium, because the story is so small, and it's really letting you in there. It's taking away all of the unnecessary elements in this format, the big showy things, the fancy 12/8 bars, and it's just putting you right in the room with them. And I think that that's so smart. For example, the first song in the show, Hear Me Out, sounds like this.
Whoever you are, you share a lot in common with my husband, Jace. I hear you there. I hear you listening.
And then a couple months later, the song Natalie Cook sounds like this.
There is something to the ritual of setting some old shit on fire. A way of saying this now lives in memory. A way of saying it's only a memory.
And then the finale of the show, The Truth, sounds like this.
The truth is, the truth is
only think you know the truth is.
They're able to get all these different sounds and feelings within the overall sound of the show is very impressive, considering that there aren't a ton of instruments in this show. This isn't like Phantom of the Opera, where put an organ in and it sounds like Phantom of the Opera. I'm exaggerating, but I think you get my point. They're working with 3 instruments and 2 people. That's a very hard sound to sustain, especially when you're being so emotional, and especially when you're trying to get all these different emotions in there and giving each song its own feel. When the overall feeling of the show is so hard to maintain to begin with. I also think that there's something that's so unpolished about these performances. Take, for example, in the song Judith Ford, this part.
I would have dinner with you.
That doesn't feel like it has been mastered in the studio and rehearsed for weeks. And that's not to say that they did a bad job. They did a great job, because they made it sound very organic. They made it sound like he was really just losing his mind. And there's a tendency in a lot of cast albums, and a lot of theater in general, to make everything sound a little bit more polished because it sounds better. Emotions are kind of confined to a 16th note pattern and the key of A flat major. And you have to maintain these melodies, and you have to get these sub harmonies and these secondary vocal lines in there, so you can feel emotional, but only within the confines of these lyrics of these rules of songwriting. Whereas this song and the show in general makes it feel a lot like the action is just happening and the music is there to help us understand that these characters are singing not because they're in a musical, but just because that's how they express themselves. And that's true in all musicals, but I think that with this musical is different in that the music sounds like it's the vessel for them to feel, not that their feelings are being expressed through song. If that makes sense, it's more of an emphasis on the emotion. They're willing to break the melody. They're willing to do things that aren't perfect singing. They're willing to scream in the middle of a song. They're willing, in the song reality, to end like this.
and you would string me along like you always do, knowing I will never let go.
They incorporate the sound design, like in the end of the Act 1 finale.
This will be the last thing.
It feels very much like the music only exists as a backdrop to the action, which I think is great because the emotion has to be the center of the story, especially in a show like this, and it does a great job with it. I wish I could play you all the music because it just sounds so good. I can't, there's too much music. But it's actually a pretty short album considering how long the show is. I think there were only 15-ish songs in the show, and there's an average of 5 songs per act, which sounds like there aren't a bunch of songs when the acts are an hour long, but it doesn't feel like that. The action flows in and out of the music so well, it feels very natural, and it feels like they've earned that. It doesn't feel like we have these song posts, this is where a song is going to be, this is where a song is going to be, write these songs, and then write some dialogue to fill it in. It feels like they wrote a story, maybe even wrote a full script, and then went, okay, this is what's going to be a song. Knowing what we know now about where the lead-in is going to be, let's write a song that feels natural from here. And I think that union of dialogue and music, especially in a show like this, where it's all encapsulated in one thing, where you can listen to the full show, music and dialogue, the fact that they're able to create that unity and harmony, get it, music, is really impressive and really well done, and makes the listening experience so much more impactful and emotional and just enjoyable. I think that they've managed to create a style that is uniquely their own, that sounds very catchy and very emotional and raw, but also has the ability to sound different between songs while still remaining in that kind of overarching style. And it also gives the performers a lot of room to really do their thing. The music is impressive without being, it's not opera or anything. It's not going to be belting, but because that's not what the show needs. But it's very impressive. Something else that I've noticed is that the actors harmonize with themselves in a lot of songs, like here.
I can't just listen back. I have to do more than listen back.
Which is a very interesting choice, and I don't know why they did it, but I actually really like it, because it always feels like it's the characters' thoughts helping them to kind of think through their actions. They're thinking about this and they're talking about it. They're talking through it with another character, or with us as the audience, or with themselves. And you can also hear that they're thinking about this in multiple different ways, and it's this chorus of voices in their head all telling them to do this thing, which makes it feel more organic, because that's how it happens. You come up with an idea, and then you go, yeah, this is a good idea here, and here, that makes sense, and yeah, so let's do this thing. And it gives it more musical style, it gives it more substance, but it also remains a two-person show. It still feels very small and personal, and I really appreciate that they did that, because it makes the show feel so much more coherent. Because overall, everything about this show feels like it was tailor-made for this medium. 36 Questions works because it knows the limitations of the medium, and it writes a show that avoids those and instead plays directly to the strengths of an audio-only format. It has music that's emotional and raw without being too showy, and has masterful performances by 2 amazing actors. The story is realistic to the point where most people can identify with some part of it, but it still remains different enough to keep the audience's attention for the entire 3-hour runtime. I'm really excited to see how Netflix adapts it, because I think it's really a piece worth studying and learning from on multiple fronts. Next week I'll be talking all about a completely different musical, Mean Girls. Until then, don't be a mean girl. Goodbye.